Harrington estate had never sounded like this, not even on the nights when the billionaire threw parties that made the whole hill glow. Tonight the sound was pure panic. Inside a nursery bigger than most people's apartments, 18 doctors packed shoulder to shoulder under a crystal chandelier, their white coats flashing like frightened birds. Machines beeped so fast they blurred into one long scream. Oxygen hissed. A heart monitor kept spiking, then dropping like it was arguing with the world. A famous children's doctor from Boston snapped orders. A specialist flown in from Switzerland shook his head. A top researcher from a New York hospital wiped sweat off his brow and said the words nobody wanted to hear: "We're losing him." In the center of the room, wrapped in soft blankets that cost more than a car, lay the billionaire's baby, Miles Harrington, just 8 months old, his lips turning a scary shade of blue, his tiny fingers cold at the tips, a strange blotchy rash spreading across his chest like ink spilled on skin. Every test came back unclear. Every medicine did nothing. And then outside the nursery window, on the other side of glass that had never been meant for someone like him, stood a boy in a coat too thin for winter, staring hard at a small potted plant on the windowsill like his life depended on it. His name was Calvin, he was 14, and he was the son of the night shift housekeeper. The doctors didn't notice him. They didn't notice the plant either, but Calvin did, and in the next few minutes he would have to decide whether to stay invisible or do something so bold it could get his family thrown out, arrested, or worse. Before we jump in, tell me this: where are you watching from right now, what city or country? And if you like stories that hit your heart and keep you guessing, subscribe and stay with me, because what this boy does next will change everything. Calvin learned how to be quiet before he learned how to be brave. No one sat him down and taught him. Life did. The Harrington property had rules that were never written on paper, but everyone who worked there knew them. Don't walk on the main paths when the family is outside. Don't look a Harrington in the eye unless you're spoken to first. Don't touch anything that isn't yours. Don't ask questions. And most of all, don't stand out. Calvin and his mom lived in a small staff cottage at the edge of the estate, past the gardens, past the fountains, past the tall gates that looked like they belonged to a palace. Their cottage had thin walls, a small kitchen, and one heater that worked when it felt like it. From Calvin's bedroom window, he could see the main house glowing on the hill like a different world. Some nights he could hear music floating on the cold air. Some mornings he could smell fresh bread from the chef's kitchen, even though their own breakfast was usually plain oatmeal. Calvin's mother, Renee, had worked for the Harringtons for 12 years. She cleaned, she washed, she polished floors until they shined like mirrors. She did it with sore hands and tired eyes because she believed a hard job was better than no job. "We're lucky," she told Calvin again and again, like she was trying to convince herself too. "We have a roof, you have school books, don't make trouble. Just stay small, stay safe." Calvin tried, he really did, but staying small didn't stop the world from stepping on him. At school, kids with clean sneakers laughed at his worn shoes. When the Harringtons' friends came over, they acted like staff were part of the walls. Calvin once watched a guest walk around a gardener as if the man was a trash can left in the way. Another time he heard the billionaire, Mr. Harrington, snap at a driver for standing where he could be seen. Calvin learned to move like a shadow. He learned which hallways were safe, which doors were for staff only, and which rooms he should never enter. He learned to swallow his words. He learned to fold his feelings into a tight little box and hide it deep, because feelings did not pay rent. The only place Calvin felt slightly real was the tiny community garden behind the staff cottages. An older groundskeeper named Mr. Dale let Calvin help sometimes. Mr. Dale didn't talk much, but he noticed things. He noticed when Calvin's coat was too thin. He noticed when Calvin came home from school quieter than normal. And he noticed Calvin's strange gift. Calvin could recognize plants faster than most adults could recognize faces. Calvin didn't learn it from a textbook. He learned it from his grandma years ago before she passed. She was the kind of woman people called when they couldn't afford a clinic. She kept dried herbs in glass jars and taught Calvin how to smell danger before it touched you. "Some plants heal," she said, holding a leaf under his nose. "Some plants hurt, and some do both depending on how they're used. Never play with what you don't understand." That's why Calvin's eyes locked onto the plant on the nursery windowsill the moment he saw it. It looked harmless, even pretty, smooth green leaves, a neat little pot wrapped in a fancy ribbon like a gift. It had arrived 3 days ago, carried in by a smiling delivery man. Calvin remembered because he had been sweeping near the side entrance when the gift was brought in. He remembered the gardener who handled it, wearing thick gloves. He remembered the way the gardener rubbed his hands afterward, like something on the plant's sap didn't feel right. And now the same gardener's gloves had been used earlier that day while cleaning near the baby's crib railing. Calvin didn't know that as a fact the way a scientist knows things. He knew it the way people who are ignored learn to know things, by watching. Watching is what you do when nobody wants to hear you speak. Inside the nursery, the doctors were in a battle. One doctor said the baby's oxygen levels were crashing. Another said the rash didn't match any allergy they'd seen. Someone mentioned a rare illness. Someone else said the baby might need emergency surgery to look inside. Calvin's stomach twisted when he heard that. Surgery on a baby sounded like a storm made of knives. He pressed his palm against the cold glass, his breath fogging it for a second before the winter air stole it away. His heart hammered so hard it felt like it was shaking his ribs. He wanted to yell, he wanted to bang on the window, but shouting inside the Harrington estate was like lighting a match in a room full of gas. Renee had warned him 1,000 times, don't draw attention, don't give them a reason. A reason could mean losing the cottage, losing the job, losing the only stability they had. Calvin turned his head and saw a security guard down the hall making rounds. The guard's posture was stiff, his walk slow and important, like he enjoyed having power. Calvin knew that guard. The guard had once told him, this area isn't for you, even when Calvin was just passing through with a laundry bag. Calvin swallowed. If he ran in there, the guard could stop him. If Calvin was wrong, he would look like a foolish kid who didn't know his place. But if he was right and said nothing, a baby could die while the smartest people in the world stared at the wrong thing. Calvin's hands trembled so badly he had to press them into his coat to steady them. He closed his eyes for a quick second and saw his grandma's face in his mind. Not a ghost, not magic, just memory. He heard her voice like a soft warning, if you see danger and stay quiet, the danger still wins. Inside, a nurse adjusted a tube. A doctor lifted a chart, someone muttered, I don't understand. That sentence hit Calvin like a bell, they don't understand, 18 experts and they don't understand. Calvin looked back at the plant, the leaf shape, the shiny surface, the way the stems bent. His brain flipped through memories the way other kids flip through video games, and then it clicked. A cold, sharp certainty landed in him, not a guess, a recognition. A plant his grandma had pointed at once and called by a name that sounded like a warning. A plant that could mess with a heart if someone touched it and then touched food or skin or a baby's mouth. A plant that could be deadly in the wrong hands even by accident. Calvin's throat went dry. He didn't have proof the way a doctor had proof. He had a pattern. He had a chain of small details the rich people never bothered to see. The ribbon-wrapped pot, the oily residue on gloves, the crib rail wiped down. The baby's strange symptoms, the timing 3 days. Calvin stepped back from the window, breathing fast. He looked toward the kitchen door across the hall. Through a small glass panel he saw his mother inside, moving quickly, carrying folded towels. Renee's face looked tired the way it always did after a long shift, tired but still trying to hold everything together. Calvin lifted a hand not to wave but to get her attention. Renee glanced up and froze when she saw him standing there near the nursery area. Her eyes widened in alarm. She mouthed one word with panic in it, Calvin. The way she said it without sound meant, what are you doing here? Move now. Renee started toward the door, her steps quick. Calvin knew what she was thinking. She was thinking of rules, of consequences, of the way the world punished people like them for small mistakes while forgiving the rich for big ones. Renee pushed the kitchen door open just enough to whisper harshly, get back to the cottage right now. Her voice was low, sharp, shaking at the edges. This is family space, you know that. Calvin's mouth opened but no words came out at first. He pointed back toward the nursery window. He pointed at the plant. Renee followed his finger and frowned like she didn't understand why he was staring at a plant at a time like this. Calvin, she warned again, and this time there was fear in it. Please don't. Behind Renee, another staff member walked by, eyes down, pretending not to see. Staff didn't get involved. That was the rule too. Calvin leaned closer and whispered, Mom, the plant. Renee blinked. What about it? Calvin's lips moved fast now because the fear in him was turning into urgency. I think it's making the baby sick. Renee's face changed so quickly it looked like someone had pulled a curtain, first confusion, then disbelief, then pure terror. What did you just say? She whispered. Calvin's chest rose and fell. I think it's poison, not on purpose, but from touching it. Renee grabbed his sleeve hard enough to hurt. Stop, her eyes flashed. You don't say that word here, you don't accuse anyone, you don't. She cut herself off, glancing around, her voice dropped even lower. Do you understand what can happen to us if you walk in there saying things you can't prove? Calvin nodded because he did understand. He understood too well. He understood that rich people didn't like being corrected by poor people. He understood that a boy like him was easy to blame and hard to believe. He understood that if the baby died, staff would still be blamed somehow because blame always rolls downhill. And yet, he also understood that if the baby died and Calvin had stayed quiet, he would carry that forever. From inside the nursery, a loud alarm beeped again, sharp and angry. A nurse's voice rose, he's dropping, someone swore under their breath. Renee flinched like the sound hit her body. Calvin watched her eyes fill with a fight she didn't want. Renee wasn't a hero type, she wasn't the kind of person who believed life was a movie where the good guy always wins. She believed life was a long shift that never ended, but she also had a heart, and she was a mother. And the sound of a baby struggling does something to a mother, no matter whose baby it is. Renee swallowed, her voice turned into a pleading whisper. Calvin, please let the doctors do their job. Calvin shook his head once, just once. They're missing it, he said. They're not looking at the right thing. Renee's grip tight. And what if you're wrong? She asked, almost crying. Calvin looked her in the eyes. Then I get punished, he said quietly. But if I'm right and I stay quiet, then we watch a baby die while the answer is sitting on the windowsill. Renee's jaw trembled. She looked at him like she was seeing him, really seeing him for the first time in a long while, not just as her son she needed to protect, but as a person with his own mind and courage. They stood there for a heartbeat that felt like a minute. Renee's eyes darted to the hallway, to the security guard, to the nursery door, to the power that lived behind that door. The guard's footsteps were coming closer. Renee made a choice, not a comfortable one, not a safe one, but a choice. She leaned in and whispered, "If you go in there, you don't yell, you don't accuse, you say you notice something, you speak with respect, you hear me." Calvin nodded fast. "Yes," Renee's voice cracked. "And you stay behind me," Calvin swallowed. "Okay." Renee took a shaky breath, straightened her uniform like she could iron fear out of it, and stepped into the hallway with Calvin half a step behind her. The security guard turned the corner and saw them. His eyes narrowed immediately. "Ma'am," he said to Renee, but his tone wasn't polite. "This area is restricted." Renee lifted her chin. "I know," she said, keeping her voice calm. "I'm assigned to linens on this floor. The nurse called for extra towels." The guard looked at Calvin like Calvin was a bug on his shoe. "And him?" Renee's hand went to Calvin's shoulder. "That's my son," she said. "He's helping me carry a basket." The guard's mouth twisted. "He's not supposed to be here." Renee kept her face steady, but her fingers dug into Calvin's shoulder. "We'll be quick," she said. The guard stepped in front of the nursery door as if his body alone could block the world. "Not that door," he snapped. "Not tonight." Calvin's stomach dropped. Renee tried again, carefully. "Sir, my son noticed something through the window about the gift plant on the sill. He thinks it might be important for the doctors to know." The guard's eyes widened, then hardened. "A kid thinks he knows better than doctors," he scoffed. Renee didn't flinch. "Not better," she said, "just different. He saw something they may not have seen." The guard's laugh was short and mean. "This isn't your place," he said. "Take your linens and go." Another alarm sounded from inside, louder than before. A doctor's voice rose, sharp with panic. The guard hesitated just for a second. That hesitation was all Calvin needed to see. People who pretend to have power still fear being blamed. The guard didn't want the baby to die on his shift. Renee saw it too. She leaned in and spoke in a quiet, careful way that sounded like respect but carried a warning. "If anything happens," she said softly, "they will ask who was in the hallway. They will ask who stopped people from sharing information. I'm only trying to help." The guard's face tightened. He glanced at the door handle. He glanced down the hall as if looking for someone to rescue him from the decision. Calvin could almost hear the guard's thoughts. "If I let them in and it's nothing, I get in trouble. If I don't let them in and the baby dies, I get in bigger trouble." The guard finally moved his hand to his radio. "Hold," he muttered, pressing the button. "I have staff at the nursery entrance requesting to report an observation." A voice crackled back, annoyed. The guard swallowed. "It's about a possible contamination from a gift item." Another pause, another crackle. 5 seconds, the voice said. The guard exhaled, unlocked the nursery door, and pointed at Renee like a warning sign. "You get 1 minute," he said. "One, you speak only if spoken to. You don't touch anything, you don't step past the doorway." Renee nodded quickly. Calvin's legs felt shaky, but his mind was sharp. Renee pushed the door open. He'd hit them first, warm air mixed with the smell of antiseptic and expensive baby powder. Light flooded out, bright, harsh, too perfect, reflecting off polished wood and soft cream walls. The room was packed with people. Doctors hovered over the crib like storm clouds. Nurses moved like quick shadows. The baby's tiny chest rose and fell too fast, like he was running in his sleep. Mr. Harrington stood near the far wall in a tailored suit, pale and stiff, his hands clenched so tight his knuckles looked white. Beside him, a woman Calvin guessed was the baby's mother held a blanket to her mouth, tears soaking the fabric. Everyone looked powerful, important, busy. Renee's uniform suddenly felt like a flag that said, "This person does not belong here." The doctor snapped his head toward the door. "Who are you?" he barked. The guard spoke quickly. "Housekeeping," he said. "They claim they have an observation." Mr. Harrington's eyes swung to Renee and Calvin, sharp and angry like a spotlight. "Observation," he repeated as if the word offended him. Renee's voice trembled but stayed polite. "Sir, I'm sorry to interrupt," she said. "My son was outside the window and noticed something about the plant on the sill. He thinks it might be important." A few doctors scoffed. One muttered, "Are you serious?" Another snapped, "We don't have time for this." Mr. Harrington took one step forward, his face tight with grief and rage. "My child is dying," he said slowly, each word heavy. "Why is a housekeeper's boy anywhere near this room?" Renee's face drained of color. Calvin felt the room pressing down on him like weight. This was the moment Renee feared, the moment when one wrong word could crush them. Calvin's mouth went dry, but he forced his voice out anyway. It came out smaller than he wanted, but it was clear. "Sir, I'm not trying to disrespect anyone," he said. I think the plant might be hurting him." The room froze for half a beat, just long enough for Calvin to feel every eye hit his face. Then the reactions came fast. A doctor laughed once, sharp and unbelieving. Another snapped, "Plants don't make bobbies turn blue." A nurse frowned at the windowsill like she was seeing it for the first time. The baby's mother looked up, eyes red, desperate for anything. Mr. Harrington's expression twisted. "Are you accusing someone of poisoning my son?" he demanded, voice rising. Renee's breath caught. Calvin shook his head quickly. "No, sir," he said. "I don't know who brought it. I'm saying some plants have sap that can be dangerous. If someone touched it and then touched the crib rail or bottles or the baby," his voice trailed off because he realized he was saying too much. He could hear his grandma's warning, "Never play with what you don't understand." He understood enough to be scared, but not enough to sound like an expert, and sounding like an expert was not his job. The senior doctor stepped forward, tall and impatient, his face hard like stone. "What plant?" he demanded. Calvin lifted a shaking finger toward the windowsill. "That one," he said. The doctor glanced over, annoyed as if he expected to see a cartoon villain. But his eyes landed on the pot wrapped in ribbon. He paused. He took 2 steps toward it. A nurse followed, cautious. The doctor leaned in, looking at the leaves, then the stems. His confident face flickered just a little. He looked up sharply. "Who brought this in?" he snapped. A staff member stammered. "It was a gift." The doctor cut him off. "Who handled it? Who placed it here?" Another doctor moved closer, suddenly interested. The baby's mother whispered, Is it possible?" Mr. Harrington stared at the plant like it had betrayed him. Renee's nails dug into Calvin's shoulder. Calvin's heart raced. He could feel the room turning, like a door in a hallway swinging open to a place no one expected. The senior doctor turned back to Calvin, his voice different now, less mocking, more sharp. "What do you think it is?" he asked. Calvin swallowed. He didn't want to say the wrong name. He didn't want to sound foolish. He searched his memory again, reaching for the word his grandma used. He could almost hear it, then like a spark, he had it. He opened his mouth. And before Calvin could speak the name out loud, the baby's monitor screamed a long, flat warning tone, and a nurse shouted, "He's crashing now!" The room exploded into motion again. Doctors rushed the crib. Someone yelled for a defibrillator. Mr. Harrington's face broke as he lunged forward, but 2 people held him back. Renee grabbed Calvin and pulled him toward the doorway. Calvin's lungs locked with fear as he watched the tiny baby's chest struggle, watched the doctors fight, watched the plant sit there quietly in its pretty ribbon like it didn't care what it was doing. Calvin's mouth stayed open, the name still stuck behind his teeth because the chaos swallowed everything. And in that loud, terrifying moment, Calvin realized something that made his blood go cold. If he didn't force the truth out right now, if he didn't do something unthinkable and step even deeper into a world that didn't want him, then the next sound he heard might be the sound of a billionaire's baby dying, and the sound of his own life being ruined right after. The flat alarm tore through the nursery like a siren that would not stop, and every person in that room moved at once, fast and sharp, like their bodies had been trained to panic with skill. A nurse grabbed the baby's tiny heel to check color, another tightened the oxygen mask with trembling hands, and the senior doctor snapped orders so quickly they stacked on top of each other, calling for extra air support, calling for a crash cart, calling for a medicine to steady the baby's heartbeat. And the sound of wheels rolling across the polished floor felt wrong in a room filled with soft blankets and expensive toys. Mr. Harrington tried to surge forward again, his face wet and twisted with fear, but 2 staff members held him back gently and firmly because they had seen grief turn into wild movement, and wild movement could pull tubes loose. The baby's mother swayed near the wall, clutching the same blanket to her mouth as if the fabric could stop the scream inside her chest, and her eyes were wide and empty in the way a person looks when the world stops being real. Renee yanked Calvin toward the doorway like she could protect him by pulling him into the hall, but Calvin dug his heels in for half a second, staring at the baby and the plant and the doctors, feeling something in him harden because the room was too full of smart people who were still missing the one thing he could see, and he could not let the fear of being punished be louder than the fear of a child dying. He stepped forward, voice cracking but loud enough to cut through the chaos, and he said, "Foxglove." And then because the word alone felt too small, he added, "It's called foxglove, it can mess with the heart." And a few heads snapped toward him like he had thrown a stone. The senior doctor's eyes flicked to the windowsill again, and in that fast glance his face changed not into kindness but into focus, the kind that shows up when a person finally sees a pattern they should have seen earlier. He barked, "Nobody touch that plant with bare hands," and a nurse in blue gloves moved quickly, double gloving without being told, then lifted the pot carefully as if it was suddenly a snake. A second doctor, older with tired eyes, took one look at the leaves and muttered a short word under his breath that sounded like agreement. The senior doctor demanded to know who brought it, who placed it, who signed for it, and a staff member stammered about a delivery and a ribbon and a card, but the details fell apart because the room had become a battlefield again. The senior doctor turned back to the baby and shouted for a specific medicine that would block the poison's effect on the heart, and a pharmacist on a video screen in the corner started speaking fast, listing doses and options. Calvin did not understand the medical words, but he understood the fear in the way the doctor's hands moved, and he understood the new tightness in Renee's grip on his arm, like she was holding him in place so he would not run farther into danger. The baby's monitor dipped again and a nurse cried out, and in that second Calvin saw something he would never forget, the way a tiny chest could fight so hard and still look so fragile, the way a baby's fingers curled and uncurled like a silent plea. The senior doctor leaned close and checked the baby's mouth, then shouted for someone to bring every bottle, every pacifier, every cloth that had been near the crib in the last day, and suddenly the whole room was searching not for a rare disease hidden inside the baby but for something that had touched him from the outside. The plant was moved into a sealed container. The ribbon was treated like evidence. The windowsill was swabbed. The crib rail was wiped. And as staff rushed to gather items, the security guard at the door stepped in, eyes darting, now frightened too, because this was not just a medical emergency anymore, it was a question of how a billionaire's child could be poisoned inside a house that was built to be untouchable. Mr. Harrington's gaze landed on Calvin with a heat that made Calvin's skin feel tight, and in that gaze Calvin could see two storms fighting, one storm of gratitude that someone might have found an answer, and one storm of rage that the answer could be something so simple and so preventable, and rage always hunted for a place to land. "How do you know this?" Mr. Harrington demanded, and even though the words were not shouted, they carried the weight of a man who was used to being obeyed. Calvin swallowed, tasting metal in his mouth from fear, and he answered with the truth he had, keeping his voice steady the way he had seen adults do when they were trying not to be crushed. "My grandma taught me plants, sir. She used to help sick people where we lived before we came here." And the senior doctor cut in sharper than a blade. "We can discuss family history later. Right now I need to know what exactly the exposure could be." And Calvin pointed with a shaking finger at the plant. Then at the crib rail, then at the stack of bottles on a side table, and he said, "If someone touched the sap and touched the rail, then touched the bottles, then the baby." And the words came out simple, almost childlike, but the logic was clean. A nurse held up a bottle and noticed something faint on the rubber nipple, a slickness that did not look like milk, and she froze, and the room froze with her for one half beat, because everyone sensed that tiny moment of discovery. The senior doctor's face tightened, and he ordered that every feeding item be replaced. That the baby's mouth be rinsed carefully, that the baby be cleaned in a way that would not stress him. And while two nurses moved with gentle speed, another doctor began explaining to Mr. Harrington in a controlled tone that foxglove could trigger heart rhythm problems, that it could cause sudden drops, that it was rare but not impossible, and Mr. Harrington listened like a man trying to breathe underwater. The baby's mother slid down the wall and sat on the floor, her legs folding without permission, and she whispered the baby's name again and again, not as a prayer, but as a rope she was holding on to so she would not fall into darkness. Renee stood stiff beside Calvin, eyes bright with tears she refused to let drop, because she knew something else was happening too, something that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with power. And she was right, because the security guard started speaking into his radio with urgent words like possible poisoning and lockdown, and within minutes the hallway outside filled with footsteps. More security arrived, black suits and earpieces, faces hard and blank like walls, and one of them spoke quietly to Mr. Harrington, who nodded once without taking his eyes off the crib. The room now had two kinds of panic, the panic of saving a baby and the panic of controlling a scandal. Calvin felt his stomach sink when he realized that even if the baby lived, the house would still need someone to blame for how close death had come. A new doctor arrived, breathless, and took over the medicine prep. And after what felt like forever but was probably only minutes, the flat screams softened into separate beeps again, still fast, still tense, but no longer flat, and the nurse's shoulders dropped a little. The senior doctor leaned back, sweat on his forehead, and said, "We have a rhythm," and that sentence moved through the room like a small sunrise. The baby's lips were still tinted blue, but the blue began to fade at the edges, slow and uneven like paint washing off. Mr. Harrington's knees seemed to weaken, and he grabbed the back of a chair to steady himself, breathing through clenched teeth, and for the first time he looked less like a billionaire and more like a father who would trade anything he owned for one steady breath from his child. Then, as if the world could not allow relief to exist without a price, a security man stepped closer to Renee and Calvin and said, "You two need to come with me." And his voice was not loud, but it left no room for refusal. Renee's face drained, Calvin's hands went cold. Renee tried to speak, but the words tangled, and she forced out, "Sir, we were trying to help," and the security man's eyes did not soften, because soft eyes did not keep jobs in places like this. Mr. Harrington heard the movement and turned sharply, and in his glance the earlier storm returned. "Not now," he snapped, but it was unclear who he was speaking to, the security team, the doctors, the universe. The senior doctor raised a hand, not to defend Renee and Calvin but to keep order, and he said, "We need to keep this room clear," and the security man took that as permission. Renee gripped Calvin's wrist like she was holding his bones together, and she led him out, past the doorway, into the bright hallway where everything suddenly felt too quiet compared to the nursery. Behind them, the baby's beeps continued, steady enough to keep hope alive but not steady enough to allow anyone to relax. The security team guided them down the corridor, not roughly but firmly, and Calvin looked back once and saw the plant container being carried away like a dangerous secret. And he saw the baby's mother still on the floor, eyes locked on the crib as if blinking could break the spell. They were brought to a small office near the service elevator, a plain room with a table and two chairs that looked out of place in a house filled with marble. The security man shut the door and the click of the lock sounded louder than it should have. Renee's voice shook as she spoke first. "Please, we didn't touch anything." Calvin only saw it through the window, and the security man sat across from them, posture straight, hands folded, face expressionless. Why was the boy in that hallway, he asked. Renee answered quickly. He helps me carry linen sometimes, I didn't think, and the man cut her off with a raised palm. This is not about what you thought, he said. This is about what happened. And he slid a notepad forward, asking for names, schedules where Renee had been working that day, who she spoke to, what time she was near the nursery, what time Calvin entered the hallway. Renee answered everything because she had learned that silence gets filled with lies by other people. Calvin listened, mind racing, because even while his body sat still, his eyes had been trained to notice what adults missed. And what he noticed now was a faint smell on the security man, a sharp perfume mixed with a chemical scent, like fresh plant sap that had been covered with expensive cologne. Calvin's gaze dropped to the man's hands, and he saw a faint yellow stain near one fingernail, almost nothing, like someone had touched something oily and wiped it away too late. Calvin's heart started pounding again, not from the baby this time, but from a new fear, a fear that twisted into a different shape. Because what if the danger was not only the plant, what if the danger was a person who knew exactly what they were doing? The security man asked Calvin directly how he recognized the plant, and Calvin repeated the simple truth, but he left out the part about the stain and the scent because he could not prove it and because Renee's earlier warning still lived in him, the warning about accusations that could destroy you. The door opened and another security person stepped in, whispering into the first man's ear. The first man's expression did not change, but his eyes sharpened and he said, "The baby has stabilized for now," as if he was reading a report. Then he continued, "Mr. Harrington wants to know one thing," and Renee swallowed hard. "Yes," she whispered. The man leaned forward slightly and asked, "Did you tell the boy to watch the nursery window?" And Renee's mouth fell open in disbelief. "No," she said. "Why would I do that?" And the man's gaze did not move. "Because sometimes people set up a hero moment," he said flatly. "Sometimes people create a problem so they can solve it," and those words hit Renee like a slap. Her eyes filled fully now, not just with fear but with hurt because she had given years of her life to this estate, scrubbing floors until her back ached, swallowing insults, staying small, and now when her child had helped save a life, she was being treated like a suspect in a cruel game. Renee's voice rose not into shouting but into a cracked plea. "My child is not a criminal," she said. "We are not like that," and the security man's voice stayed cold. "That is what everyone says," he replied. Calvin felt rage flicker in his chest, hot and bright, but he pushed it down because rage in a room like this was a trap. Instead he focused on details, the way his grandma taught him to focus, because details were truth when people tried to rewrite you. Calvin looked at the notepad again and noticed the security man's pen had a tiny leaf design on it, a cheap design almost like a florist's brand, and the pen smelled faintly like the same sharp perfume. Then the door opened again, and this time it was not security. It was a nurse with tired eyes and a face that held a small piece of kindness. "The doctor wants the boy," she said, and the security man hesitated, then stood and led Calvin and Renee back toward the nursery. As they walked, Calvin saw staff lined along the walls, whispering behind hands, and he saw how rumors moved faster than facts. One maid's eyes flicked to Renee with pity, another with fear, and Calvin felt a deep shame try to crawl onto his shoulders, the kind of shame poor people are trained to carry even when they did nothing wrong. Inside the nursery, the air felt slightly calmer, but only slightly. The machines still beeped, the baby still looked fragile, the doctors looked drained, like soldiers after a battle that might start again at any moment. Mr. Harrington stood closer now, one hand resting on the crib rail, his fingertips brushing the wood like he was afraid the baby would disappear if he let go. He turned when Renee and Calvin entered, and for a moment his face softened just barely because the baby was still alive, and alive changes a person's eyes. The senior doctor stepped forward and spoke to Calvin with a different tone than before, less mocking, more careful. "Son," he said, "I need you to tell me exactly what you saw and when." And Calvin told him again, this time adding more details: the gift delivery, the residue on gloves, the gardener's discomfort. The way the plant had been placed right near the baby's airflow, right where anyone passing would brush it. The doctor listened, then asked a nurse to bring the gift card that came with the plant. A staff member handed over a small white card with gold edges. Mr. Harrington took it, eyes scanning. The card was simple, with only a short message and no signature anyone recognized. Mr. Harrington's jaw tightened and he handed it to the security lead. The senior doctor asked a second doctor, a quiet one with gentle hands, to run a quick toxin screen focused on plant-based heart poisons, and the doctor nodded and moved to a computer station. The baby's mother stood now, leaning on the wall, eyes still wet, but a small light of hope had returned, and she looked at Calvin like she did not know whether to hug him or fear what he represented in this moment. Mr. Harrington watched Calvin for a long beat and his voice came out rough when he finally spoke. "You saved my son," he said, and the words were heavy, not sweet, as if they hurt to say. Renee's breath hitched. Calvin stared down at his shoes because being thanked by someone like Mr. Harrington felt like standing too close to a fire, warm in one second, dangerous in the next. I didn't do it, Calvin said softly, I only noticed. And Mr. Harrington's eyes narrowed, not in anger this time but in a kind of painful honesty. Noticing is more than what the rest of us did, he replied. Then, as if the estate could not allow this moment to stay human for long, one of the doctors called out from the computer, voice tense, the toxin screen is consistent with a cardiac glycoside exposure, and the senior doctor's face hardened. Mr. Harrington's shoulders went rigid again, the room seemed to shrink as the truth took shape in official words. The senior doctor turned to the security team and said, "This needs to be treated as an exposure event, not a mystery illness." And that sentence sounded like a door shutting on all the earlier guesses. Mr. Harrington's voice became steel. "Find out who sent it," he said. The security lead nodded quickly, already on his radio, and people began moving again, not with medical urgency now but with hunting urgency. The baby's mother stepped forward, palms pressed together, whispering thanks toward the doctors, toward anyone who would listen, and then she looked at Renee, eyes soft, and said, "I'm sorry," so quietly it almost vanished, and Renee nodded without trusting her voice. Calvin thought the worst part might be over, but then the baby's monitor chirped strange again, not the flat scream but a new pattern, uneven, jerky. A nurse leaned in, frown deepening. The senior doctor's head snapped toward the screen. The baby's lips began to tint again, and the rash which had paused suddenly crawled farther, darker at the edges. The senior doctor cursed under his breath and demanded a repeat assessment. The calm cracked instantly, and the room fell back into controlled panic. "That shouldn't happen if the exposure stopped," the older doctor muttered, and those words made Calvin's stomach drop because it meant the plant was not the only path. It meant there was still poison somewhere, still touching the baby, still feeding the problem. The senior doctor turned sharply to staff. "Who changed the baby today?" he demanded. "Who fed him, who bathed him, who handled his toys?" And the nanny, a woman in a neat uniform with perfect hair, stepped forward and said she had, voice calm but eyes too bright. The security lead moved closer to her instantly. The nanny lifted her hands as if she was innocent, and she said, "I did everything the same as always," and Mr. Harrington's gaze went hard. Calvin looked at the nanny's hands and saw a thin, almost invisible sheen near her wrist, like dried sap that had been washed but not fully removed. His mind raced again, and he remembered the security man's stained fingernail, the cologne smell, the leaf design on the pen, and suddenly the pieces did not feel random. Then the baby let out a weak, thin cry, a sound that cut through the room like a knife because it was not loud enough, and the baby's mother gasped and rushed forward, and the senior doctor held her back gently, telling her the baby needed space to breathe. Calvin's chest tightened so hard it hurt, because he realized the truth was bigger than one plant and one moment of bravery, and the twist of it was cruel because the closer Calvin got to saving the baby, the closer he got to becoming the easiest person to blame. The senior doctor barked for every toy and blanket to be removed and replaced. Nurses moved fast. The nanny's eyes darted toward the hallway as if she was measuring an escape. The security lead signaled 2 guards subtly, and they stepped nearer. Mr. Harrington's voice dropped into something deadly quiet. "Nobody leaves," he said. The estate outside the nursery door suddenly felt like a locked box. Calvin saw Renee's face, pale but steady, and he knew she was thinking the same thing he was thinking, that this house was not a home, it was a system, and systems protect themselves first. Then a guard rushed in and whispered to the security lead, and the lead's eyes widened, and he looked straight at Calvin, not with kindness, not with thanks, but with suspicion sharpened into a weapon. "We just checked the security footage from the hallway window," the lead said, voice tight, "and the clip from the last hour is gone." And those words slammed into the room like a new alarm, because missing footage meant someone had acted, someone had planned, someone had power inside the system, and before Renee could even speak, before Calvin could even breathe, the security lead pointed at them and said, "Take them back to the office." And at the same time the baby's monitor spiked wildly again. And the senior doctor shouted for immediate intervention, and the nursery exploded into motion while Renee clutched Calvin's hand like she would not let the estate swallow him whole. And Calvin realized that saving a billionaire's baby was not the end of the danger. It was the beginning of a fight he never asked for, a fight where the truth could get buried the same way the footage just had. And as the guards closed in and the baby's beeps turned frantic again, Calvin locked eyes with the nanny for one split second and saw something in her expression that made his blood run cold, not fear, not confusion, but a quick flash of anger, like she was furious the baby was still alive. The second crash came like a wave that did not care about money, status, or the size of the chandelier above the crib, and the room snapped back into motion so fast it felt like time was skipping. The heart monitor stuttered into a messy rhythm. The baby's tiny chest worked too hard for such a small body, and the senior doctor's voice sharpened as he ordered the team to treat this like ongoing exposure, not a single accident, because the symptoms were rising again even after the plant had been sealed away, which meant something else was still reaching the baby, still touching him, still feeding the danger. 2 nurses moved with practiced calm, swapping out tubes, replacing the oxygen line, wiping the baby's lips and gums with careful strokes, changing the blanket, changing the cloths, changing anything that could carry residue. While another doctor spoke into a phone demanding the antidote be prepared again, faster, and in the corner Mr. Harrington stood rigid with terror, his face pulled tight like he was holding himself together with pure force. Because relief had lasted only minutes before fear grabbed him by the throat again, Renee and Calvin were pulled back toward the hallway, the security lead's hand hovering near Renee's shoulder like a warning, and Calvin felt the unfairness of it burn in his chest, because the baby was fighting for breath, and yet the estate was already choosing a target to blame, already turning toward the easiest people to crush. Renee's eyes were wet but fierce, and she whispered to Calvin without looking at him, "Stay calm, don't argue, don't let them pull you into anger." And Calvin tried, but his body shook anyway as they were guided into the small office again, the same plain table, the same hard chairs, the same locked click at the door that sounded like the world shutting. The security lead sat across from them, posture stiff, voice clipped, and he repeated questions like a hammer, asking where Calvin got his knowledge, asking if anyone told him what to say, asking if he had ever been in the main house before, asking if his mother ever complained about money, asking if Renee ever argued with a supervisor, and Renee answered with the truth until her voice turned thin from strain, because she knew that when powerful people are scared, they sometimes do not search for facts. They search for someone to punish. Calvin watched the man's hands again. Watched the faint stain near the fingernail, watched the expensive cologne that sat too heavy in a room that smelled like cheap paper and disinfectant, and Calvin's mind kept circling one thought that would not leave him alone. The danger was not only a plant, the danger was a person who knew how to hide. A soft knock came at the door and the nurse from earlier stepped in, eyes tired but steady, and she said the doctors needed the boy now, because the baby's readings were matching the plant poison but not responding the way they should unless they found the exact route of exposure, and the security lead hesitated, then stood, and as he walked out ahead of them, Calvin noticed something else, a tiny detail that made his stomach drop deeper. Because the security lead's key ring swung at his side and one keychain was shaped like a leaf, glossy green, the kind people buy from florist shops as a cute decoration. It was small, silly, easy to miss, but Calvin had learned that easy-to-miss things can decide who lives and who dies. Back in the hallway, the estate felt like it had changed into a different place, quieter on purpose, as if the house itself was holding its breath so the outside world would not hear the truth forming inside, and staff stood along the walls with their hands folded, eyes down, because fear tells poor people to become furniture. When Calvin and Renee entered the nursery again, the air felt tighter, the room hotter, the lights harsher, and the baby's mother stood with her palms pressed together, not moving, staring at the crib as if blinking could break the fragile line between life and loss. The senior doctor met Calvin at the door, his earlier doubt replaced by urgency, and he spoke quickly in words Calvin could follow, saying, "We removed the plant, we cleaned surfaces, we replaced feeding items, but the baby still dipped, so we need to find what else carried the poison and we need to find it now." And Calvin nodded, scanning the room the way he always did, letting his eyes move over objects instead of people first, because objects do not lie the way scared adults can. On a side table sat a gift basket with tiny baby items, lotion, powder, a soft toy, a ribbon blanket, a card holder, and Calvin's eyes stuck there because he remembered the ribbon on the plant, the neat fancy style of it, the way the pot had been wrapped like a celebration, and he realized someone who sent a plant could also send other gifts, because gifts are the perfect hiding place in a house where everyone assumes pretty things are safe. Calvin stepped closer, and Renee's hand twitched as if to stop him, but the doctor waved permission, and Calvin leaned in, careful not to touch, and he saw a baby lotion bottle with a gold label, the cap smeared with something faintly oily, and right beside it a pacifier clip with a shiny plastic charm shaped like, again, a leaf. His throat tightened because the pattern was too loud now, leaf after leaf after leaf, as if someone was marking their work without realizing a boy like Calvin would read it. A nurse followed his gaze and said that basket arrived 2 days ago, sent from a friend of the family, and Mr. Harrington's jaw clenched because he could not even remember all the friends who sent gifts, because people like him receive gifts the way other people receive mail. Calvin stared at the pacifier clip and then at the baby's bottle nipple that had looked slick earlier, and his mind built a simple picture. Someone touches poison, then touches lotion cap or pacifier clip, then the nanny uses it during care, then the baby's mouth meets it. It was not complicated, it was just hidden behind wealth and trust. The senior doctor demanded gloves, and a nurse carefully lifted the lotion bottle into an evidence bag. Another nurse swabbed the cap, another swabbed the pacifier clip. The baby's mother made a small sound, half sob, half breath, and she whispered that she had rubbed lotion on the baby's hands earlier because his skin was dry from winter air, and her eyes filled with guilt so fast it looked like pain spreading. Mr. Harrington turned toward the nanny who stood near the wall, face too controlled, hands clasped, and he asked in a low voice whether she used that basket, and the nanny nodded quickly, saying yes, she had used the lotion. She thought it was harmless, she thought it was a kind gift. The security lead stepped forward immediately, voice sharp, and said the basket needed to be traced, the sender identified, all deliveries reviewed, and his tone sounded helpful, but Calvin heard something else in it, a hunger to steer the story away from himself. The senior doctor focused on the baby again, ordering the team to flush and stabilize, and once the possible second route was identified, the antidote began to work more steadily, not like magic, but like a lock finally meeting the right key. The baby's monitor settled into a rhythm that was still fragile but less wild, and the blue around his lips softened again, and the baby's tiny fingers relaxed from their tight curl. The baby's mother collapsed into a chair, shaking, and she kept whispering the baby's name like a promise she was scared to break. Mr. Harrington stared at his son for a long, silent moment. Then he turned and looked at Calvin with eyes that held something new, not just fear, not just anger, but a heavy kind of respect that felt strange in a house where boys like Calvin were usually treated like air. "You saw what we didn't," Mr. Harrington said, voice rough, and Calvin's mouth went dry because he did not know how to stand inside praise from a man whose world had always been closed to him. Calvin tried to answer modestly, but the senior doctor interrupted again because the clock still mattered, and he asked Calvin the most important question of all, not as a challenge but as a need. How would someone get the poison onto these items without being noticed? And Calvin answered in simple words, with gloves or with something oily like sap, and then they wipe their hands and nobody thinks to check because it's a gift. And the doctor nodded hard, and the security lead nodded too quickly as if he wanted to claim the idea. Then the nurse who had brought the evidence swabs returned with a quick preliminary result, and said the residue on the lotion cap matched the same plant toxin pattern as the plant itself. And the room went cold in a new way, because now there was no longer doubt that this was more than bad luck, more than a simple accident, and Mr. Harrington's shoulders went stiff like steel bars, the estate's calm mask cracked, and the hunt began in full. Security called for every delivery log, every gate record, every camera feed from the last week, and the security lead spoke into his radio with clipped commands that sounded powerful. But Calvin noticed the lead's eyes kept darting toward Calvin in quick flashes, like he was measuring a threat. A different doctor, a calmer one with kind eyes, gently guided Renee to a corner and told her the baby was stabilizing, and Renee's knees weakened so badly she had to grip the back of a chair, because she had been holding herself upright with fear for so long she did not know what to do when the fear loosened. She looked at Calvin like she wanted to cry and scold him at the same time, because her son had stepped into a storm to do the right thing, and she had always taught him storms were not safe. Calvin kept his eyes on the evidence bag with the lotion bottle and on the leaf-shaped pacifier clip, and his mind kept working, because he realized the truth had to reach the right person before someone twisted it. The security lead moved to a desk, opening a laptop, calling up camera footage, and he announced that the hallway clip was missing, pretending surprise again, and he suggested the system glitched, but the senior doctor's face tightened because rich houses do not glitch when it matters unless someone makes them. Mr. Harrington listened, then said one quiet sentence that made the entire room shift. "Bring in the outside investigators," and the security lead's head snapped up like he had been slapped. The lead tried to argue, saying they could handle it internally, saying outside involvement would create media risk, saying it could scare the baby's mother, but Mr. Harrington's voice stayed low and deadly. "My son almost died in my own home," he said. "I do not care about headlines right now." And that was the moment Calvin understood something about real power. When it is afraid, it stops caring about reputation and starts caring about control. Within an hour, 2 outside investigators arrived, plain clothes, calm faces, not impressed by chandeliers. And the first thing they did was separate people for short interviews, not to scare them but to stop the story from being rewritten. Renee was interviewed, then the nanny, then the chef, then the gardener, then the security lead. And Calvin watched the security lead answer with a smooth voice and perfect posture, but his eyes were sharp like knives when he thought nobody was looking. When it was Calvin's turn, one investigator sat with him and asked him to describe exactly what he saw, and Calvin explained in simple detail, starting from the plant's arrival, the residue on gloves, the leaf pattern, the timing of the baby's symptoms, the missing camera clip. And then Calvin took a breath and said the one thing he had kept inside until now, because now he realized he had to say it while truth was still fresh. He said he noticed the security lead's fingernail stain and strong cologne that smelled like it had been used to cover a sharp plant scent, and he said he noticed the leaf keychain, and the investigator's eyes narrowed, not in disbelief, but in interest, because investigators live on small details. The investigator asked Calvin whether he had ever seen that leaf keychain before, and Calvin said yes. He had seen similar leaf charms at the florist shop on the edge of town when he went with Mr. Dale to buy garden supplies once, and he even remembered the shop's name because it was written in green cursive on their bags, and Calvin described it as best he could. The investigator nodded and stepped out, and within another hour someone was at that florist shop checking records, because real investigations do not start with assumptions, they start with receipts. While all of that happened, the baby's condition slowly improved, not in a dramatic miracle way, but in a steady, hard-earned way, the beeps leveling out, the color returning to his cheeks, the rash stopping its spread and beginning to fade at the edges, and each small change felt like a brick placed back into a wall that had been collapsing. The baby's mother finally allowed herself to touch her son's tiny hand, and her whole body shook as if she was afraid to break him, and the senior doctor said the words everyone needed. "He's responding," and then softer, "He's going to make it." And the sound that came out of the baby's mother was not pretty, not polite, but it was pure relief pouring out of a person who had been drowning. Mr. Harrington turned away for a second and pressed his fist to his mouth, eyes wet, because even billionaires cry when the thing they love most is saved. Renee slid down onto a chair and covered her face, and for a moment Calvin saw his mother not as a worker trying to survive, but as a person who had been terrified of losing everything, including her son, to the consequences of bravery. Then the twist Calvin feared tried to rise anyway, because the security lead moved into the nursery again with a controlled face, and announced that the delivery records showed Renee had been near the service entrance when the plant and basket arrived, and he implied that meant she had access, and Renee's head snapped up, eyes wide with shock, because being near a door was not a crime, it was her job. The investigator stepped in smoothly and said, "Access is not evidence," and the security lead's jaw tightened. The investigator then asked the security lead for his own access logs and device activity, because missing footage does not erase itself. The lead smiled in a thin way and said his phone was personal, his device was private, but the investigator's voice stayed calm and firm. "We have grounds, and we have a child who nearly died, and we have a system that was altered," and the smile on the security lead's face faded. Mr. Harrington watched this exchange and his eyes sharpened, because rich people recognize deflection the way poor people recognize hunger. The outside team checked the security system history, and what they found did not come from a rumor, it came from the system itself. The missing hallway clip had been deleted using the security lead's admin credentials, at a time when he said he was in the West Wing, and the deletion was followed by a manual overwrite command that only a handful of people in the estate could perform. The room went silent in the heavy way that happens when truth stops being a possibility and becomes a fact. Renee's breath caught, Calvin's stomach turned, the nanny's eyes widened. Mr. Harrington's face went still, and stillness on a powerful man can be more frightening than shouting. The security lead tried to speak, but the investigator cut in and said they had already sent someone to the florist's shop, and the florist confirmed a plant, and a leaf charm pacifier clip came from a bulk order placed with a corporate card tied to a security company account, and that account traced back to the security lead's own side business, a fact he had never disclosed to Mr. Harrington. The security lead's posture stiffened, and he tried to claim the card was stolen, but the investigator held up a printed copy of the order form with a signature match, and then the final twist snapped into place. The order included not just the plant and gift basket, but also a note request, typed in clean language, instructing the florist to write the card in a neutral tone from a family friend, and to deliver it during a window of time when the baby's mother would be distracted by a scheduled charity meeting, meaning someone had studied the household schedule closely. The security lead's eyes flicked to Renee for a fraction of a second, and that glance gave away what his plan had been all along, because it was never about the baby alone, it was about the chaos after the baby, the blame that would fall, the staff who could be framed, the hero moment that could be flipped into a crime, and the control he could gain from a family terrified of scandal. And the investigator asked him why. The security lead said nothing at first, then he tried to stand, and two other security men moved automatically to stop him. But the investigator raised a hand and said, "Let him speak." And the security lead's voice finally cracked into ugly honesty, saying he had been ignored for years, that he had watched Mr. Harrington trust outsiders and donate millions while loyal people like him remained replaceable, that he wanted leverage. That he wanted a payout, that he wanted to prove the estate was not safe without him, and that if the baby died it would force the family to depend on him forever. And the moment those words landed, the nursery felt like it lost oxygen, because people can handle accidents but they struggle to face deliberate harm. The baby's mother let out a sound like a broken gasp, and she had to be held up by a nurse. Renee stared in disbelief, tears sliding down her face now, because the worst fear she carried, being blamed for rich people's problems, had almost become her reality. Mr. Harrington took one step toward the security lead, voice low, "You used my child," he said, and the security lead looked away, because even the boldest criminals sometimes cannot meet the eyes of a furious father. The investigators placed the security lead under arrest without drama, cuffs clicking softly in a room filled with baby toys, and that contrast, cold metal against soft blankets, felt like a lesson about how evil hides inside ordinary shapes. When the security lead was let out, the hallway filled with whispers again, but this time the whispers were not aimed at Renee, and Renee finally exhaled in a long, shaking breath as if she had been holding it for years. The senior doctor stepped toward Calvin and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, speaking quietly so the room would not turn it into a show. "You did the right thing," he said, and Calvin's eyes stung because those simple words felt like sunlight on skin that had never seen much warmth. The baby's condition stabilized fully over the next day, and by morning the nursery that had been chaos turned into a quiet place of soft breathing and cautious smiles. And when the baby finally opened his eyes and let out a small, sleepy sound, his mother cried again, not from fear this time, but from joy so deep it looked like pain leaving her body. Mr. Harrington stood beside the crib and watched his son blink up at the world, and he did something Calvin never expected a man like him to do. He turned to Renee, and in front of doctors and staff and investigators, he apologized. He did not apologize in a fancy speech, he did it in plain words that mattered more because they were plain. "I let this house treat you like you were invisible," he said, "and invisibility is how danger walked past us." And Renee covered her mouth, shoulders shaking, because in her whole working life she had rarely heard a powerful person admit wrong without being forced. Mr. Harrington then turned to Calvin and his voice softened. "You saved my son," he said, "and I tried to let fear turn you into a suspect." And Calvin swallowed hard because he wanted to be brave, but he was still a boy who had lived under rules that said people like him do not get to be seen. Mr. Harrington told the investigators he wanted protections put in place for staff who report safety concerns, and he ordered the humiliating service entrance sign removed that same day, the one that treated workers like they were stains on the ground. He asked the senior doctor to help set up a training for staff about hazardous substances, not because staff were the danger, but because knowledge keeps everyone safer. He paid for Renee to take time off without fear of losing her job, and he offered Calvin a scholarship plan that would cover his education through college, with one condition that was not cruel but hopeful: that Calvin keep learning, keep asking, keep noticing, because the world needs people who see what others ignore. Renee tried to refuse at first out of pride, but Mr. Harrington shook his head and said, "This is not charity, it is repayment." And Calvin realized that sometimes the unthinkable thing is not only speaking up in a room full of experts, it is also allowing yourself to be valued when you have been trained to accept scraps. Weeks later, the baby recovered fully, healthy, color returned, laughter returned, and the estate looked the same from the outside, but inside it had changed because one poor boy's courage forced a rich house to look at its blind spots. Calvin began spending weekends helping Mr. Dale in the garden again, but now he also had books about botany and science, real books, the kind he used to stare at in the library and think belonged to other kids. Renee stood taller not because life became perfect, but because she no longer felt like her family's survival depended on silence alone. And Mr. Harrington, a man who had built his life on control, learned a lesson he could not buy: that a person's worth is not measured by their title, their uniform, or where they sleep, and that ignoring the people who keep your world running is not just cruel, it is dangerous. The life-changing lesson sat in the center of everything like a truth too big to deny. Sometimes the small people are the ones carrying the biggest answers, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is speak even when your voice shakes, because one honest voice can save a life and expose a lie at the same time. If this story moved you, don't scroll away like it meant nothing. Tap the like button, share it with someone who needs hope, and drop your location in the comments so I can see where you're watching from, because this community is growing one heart at a time, and your support matters. Most importantly, subscribe to this channel to support our growth and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next life-changing story.